Hi everybody and welcome back to the channel. This morning I'm going to be harvesting my St. Johns Wort to make two different types of medicines, so I thought you guys might want to join me. So before I get to harvesting, I thought I would show you what St. Johns Wort looks like. I've had this patch in my medicine wheel garden now for about 3 years. It's very, very happy, as you can see. So first we'll take a look at the flower of St. Johns Wort. Botanical name is Hypericum perforatum. The flower has 5 yellow petals. One of the ways that we can identify it. Whenever you're using field guides, my favorite is Newcomb's. It'll always ask you, how many petals the flower has. We're also going to take a closer look at the leaves here. And as you can see, they are entire leaves. There's no tooths or no teeth or lobes. And it also is what we call a smooth leaf. They are opposite each other on the stem. As you can see, they're directly across from each other. And one of the ways, and it'll be very difficult for me to pick it up on camera today, but I can try. One of the ways to identify St. Johns Wort is by holding, and let's see if we can actually, it's very bright, so I don't even know if you guys will be able to see it or not, if I can get close enough. So we'll see if that shows up, but you can hold a piece of St. Johns Wort leaf up to the sun. And if we're lucky enough, you can actually see little perforations, what looks like someone took a pin and poked holes to the leaf. And that's how it gets its Latin name, Hypericum perforatum, because it looks like the leaf is perforated. And it was believed that you could actually use St. Johns Wort in exorcisms to capture evil souls and stuff like that, or evil energies. I'll get into the mythological and sort of magical uses of this plant in another video, but suffice it to say it has a rich history. It gets its common name because it tends to flower around St. John the Baptist Day, which is right around midsummer and the summer solstice as well. So I'm going to get to harvesting. I tend to harvest about the top 25% of a plant, and I would never take the entire population of my St. Johns Wort patch. I don't want to stress the species out, and I want it to continue to grow every year, which it has. But I take about the top 25 to 30%. If we go too far down a plant, and you can actually see it, the further and further down you go, the less blooms you have and the more fibrous the stalk is, which means you're basically watering down your medicine. So I'm going to get to harvesting, and you guys will join me in my kitchen when I'm done, and I will show you what I will be using my Hypericum for today. So welcome to my kitchen. I'm getting ready to start processing my St. Johns Wort, and I've harvested enough to be able to do 2 things with it today, which I'm excited about. But the first thing I want you to do is take a closer look. I didn't mention this when I was outside, but one of the ways to identify St. Johns Wort is if you crush one of the petals in your hand, you can see that a red pigment comes out. So there's really no mistaking it. This red pigment is known as hypericin, which is one of the main chemical constituents in Hypericum and St. Johns Wort. In the 1980s, they did a whole ton of research. I think it was the 80s. They did a ton of research on hypericin and discovered, of course, it's antidepressant, it's anxiolytic, or helping with anxiety properties, is among many of the other things. Of course, this is one of my favorite nervines. So the first thing I'm going to be doing this morning is making tincture with it. So I'm going to be making a 500 milliliter jar of tincture. I use mason jars. I haven't gotten around to being able to afford to buy the wide mouth amber jars. They're very pricey. So with mason jars, I just make sure that I store them in a place that they're not exposed to light, so that way my tinctures don't oxidize too quickly. So this is a 500 milliliter jar. For my friends in the States, that's a pint. And I use 87 grams of herb material for my 500 milliliters of tincture. And that gives me a 5-to-1 ratio, so 5 parts alcohol to 1 part herb material. And that's what I'm going for when I make my tinctures. Because I'm a clinical herbalist, it's really important that I have standardization across my medicines, and that I make sure that every tincture in my clinic is made to that 5-to-1 ratio, and I follow that all the time. But for folks practicing at home and they're more folk herbalists or just herbalists for their family, you know, you don't have to be as precise if you don't want to. So I'm going to chop my herb material finely, and if you do not have a mezzaluna, I highly, highly recommend that you get one. It gets its name because of the moon-shaped blade, but as you can see, it makes the chopping work so much easier. And of course, I want to make sure that I keep my blade sharp, which I always do. So of course I use St. Johns Wort for depression and anxiety and those types of nervous related conditions. But one area that a lot of folks don't realize where St. Johns Wort shines is it actually has the ability to repair nerve tissue, and it's an amazing neural anti-inflammatory, meaning it reduces inflammation in nerve tissues in the brain. So I really like using it for any type of nerve damage, and in combination with other herbs that have an affinity for brain tissue, things like ginkgo, pine, rosemary, in memory type formulas. So the goal when you're chopping your herb material is to work quickly, because the minute you start chopping your herb material, it starts to oxidize. So this is not a good time to take a phone call from grandma. She can leave a message and you'll have to call her back. And in general, my teacher always taught me if you can't fit all 87 grams in your 500 milliliter jar, you didn't chop it fine enough. And I usually find that is the case. So this is looking pretty good. And I think I may have dropped a little piece on the floor. Chop that. And like I said, I want to work fairly quickly, ensuring that my medicines don't oxidize too much. And then you just fill your jar. I like these wide mouth funnels. I have them for canning, but it makes filling my jars so much easier. And of course, it always goes without saying, ensure that you're properly labeling everything. What is it? In this case, it's going to be Hypericum perforatum tincture and a 5:1 ratio. And I will date it as well. And that's your bare bones information. You know, if you want to include harvesting locations and those types of things on your labels, you can do so as well. But for me, most of my medicines come from my property, so I know that. So as you can see, all 87 grams fit into the jar quite nicely. And then I'm going to use my menstruum, which is 30% alcohol and 10% vegetable glycerin. And again, that's what I was taught. I always like to say, you know, if you ask 100 herbalists how they do things, you're going to get 101 different answers. So go with what works for you and what feels right to you. Whenever I am making tinctures and using mason jars, alcohol will corrode metal. So it's really, really, really important that you use a barrier of some kind. In this case, I'm just using parchment paper. And that's going to prevent the alcohol from coming in contact with the metal lid and corroding it. And I just made 500 milliliters of St. Johns Wort Hypericum perforatum tincture. I'll label it and get it into my, my clinic apothecary. And I'm just going to tidy up and come back in just a few minutes and show you what I'm doing with the rest of my St. Johns Wort. So my last project is to make some St. Johns Wort infused carrier oil. And the process is going to be pretty similar, so you're still going to be watching me chop. I've got my herbs weighed out, and I use a similar amount. Because I make products that are for sale, it's important, again, that I have these standardized measurements. So I'm just going to get chopping. One thing to be cognizant about when you're harvesting your St. Johns Wort, remember that red pigment I was telling you about, the Hypericum? It is a photosensitizing component to the plant, meaning that your skin is going to be more sensitive to sun. So if you get a lot of it on your hands, just make sure you wash them when you get home, because you will be more prone to burning. And that is also true if you're taking the tincture internally, by the way. So if I ever have clients that are on St. Johns Wort tincture in the summer months, I always make sure that they know that they're going to be a little bit more prone to burning. So when I make my herbal infused oils, I use fresh herbs. And I know that's going to get a gasp from a few people, because again, that's back to that old saying of ask 100 herbalists, you'll get 101 different answers. Many herbalists are quite firm in their belief that you can only use dried plant material for making herbal infused oils. And it is definitely trickier. There is a water component that I now have to be aware of. Fresh herbs have water. Water and oil don't mix. If we remember back to, you know, our biologies and our sciences, the water component could cause the oil to go rancid. It could also result in mold. So I do have to take a few extra steps in order to ensure that my end product doesn't mold. One of the things you can do is leave your jar out with the lid off on a sunny day, and then the water will evaporate off of your herbs. You can also gently warm it. Those are my two favorite methods. I'll leave this because we have a beautiful sunny day. I will leave this outside in the sun. And after one day, I won't even really be too worried about water content. Most of the water will evaporate off. You could also use a double boiler. And just again, gently warm. You don't want to burn your herbs or your oil. It'll cause it to go rancid almost immediately. So using a double boiler is a good trick as well. So for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to put the oil on for now and show you guys how to do that. But it's the same kind of idea. As you can see, the jar is almost full of my chopped herb material. And I'm going to pour. I'm choosing to use organic cold pressed sunflower oil. Again, this has a lot to do with having products for sale. I can't use oils that have nuts in them, and there's a lot of allergies, so sunflower oil tends to be a really safe one, and it goes on really nicely as well. Because the sunflower oil is not going to interact with the metal, I don't have to worry about parchment paper. But in terms, like I've made St. Johns Wort infused carrier oil before with dried St. Johns Wort, and the product was vastly inferior. So for me, the extra steps and the protocols that I have to go through to ensure that I don't have water in my oil are well worth the effort for a higher quality end product. So like I said, I'll have this out in the sun probably for most of the day, just in a safe spot where my cat won't knock it over or my kid won't knock it over. And let the sun warm up the oil for me to allow the water content from the plants to evaporate off. Another really good trick is also to let your plants wilt a little bit. This is something I tend to do with herbs that have really high water content, like comfrey. Comfrey, if you've ever worked with it before, has a ton of water, especially in the stalk. And if you don't let the plant wilt first, you know, you'll end up with a pretty nasty end product. So it is important to deal with the water content. And below in the description, I will put a link. I have a blog post that details all the steps and instructions you'll need to make herbal infused oils. So you can check that out if that's something of interest. But for now, I am done with St. Johns Wort. I have other medicines to harvest for today, so I will say farewell. And thank you so very much for spending some of your time with me to learn about plants and herbs. I feel very blessed and very grateful that there's enough people out there that want to hear me jibber jabber about plants. So until the next video, I hope you guys are all well and take care.